One might argue that if the Concord had never been signed, Ivy Marlowe would never have set foot inside Ravenscourt Academy at all. But then again, if the vampire courts hadn't spent 3 centuries needing exactly one human witness inside their walls to prove the old treaty still held, nobody would have gone looking for a girl like her in the first place. So really, if one thought about it, the whole business was the fault of dead diplomats who'd been rotting in their graves since before her grandmother was born. All of it. Ivy wasn't supposed to be remarkable. That had always been the point of the Ward program. Take one human, ordinary as bread, plant her inside the most powerful vampire academy in the Western courts for 4 years, and let her prove, simply by surviving breakfast, that humans and vampires could still share a roof without anyone getting bled dry. She'd been selected the way she understood most things in her life happened to her. By paperwork, by luck, by somebody else's decision made 3 floors above her in an office she'd never see. She hadn't wanted it. She also hadn't been given a vote. The carriage that carried her up the mountain road to Ravenscourt arrived at dusk because vampire academies apparently thought sunset was a personality trait, and Ivy spent the whole climb with her nose pressed to the window, watching black spires rise out of the mist like teeth. The road itself took most of the day, switchbacking up through pine forest, so dense the afternoon light never fully reached the carriage floor, past waystones carved with old warding symbols Ivy didn't recognize and didn't especially want explained to her. Twice, the driver, a silent, weathered man who never once looked back at his passenger, stopped to let something large and unseen cross the road ahead, and both times Ivy had sat very still, hands folded in her lap, doing her level best to look like a girl who belonged on this mountain and not like exactly what she was. 17 years old, entirely alone, carrying one small trunk of belongings toward a building 600 years older than the country she'd been born in. She'd read everything the Concord office had given her twice over before leaving. Pamphlets on academy etiquette, a glossary of vampire courtesies no human was expected to fully master, but was nonetheless expected to attempt, a single terse paragraph on what to do in the event of an incident, which struck Ivy, rereading it for the 3rd time somewhere around the mountain's second switchback, as a remarkably casual way to describe the possibility of being killed by one's own classmates. None of it had prepared her for the actual, physical fact of the academy itself. The way its spires seemed to swallow the last of the daylight rather than simply stand against it. The way the temperature dropped a full 10 degrees the moment the carriage passed beneath its outer gate. The way something in the old stone itself seemed to notice her arriving, long before any living resident of the school did. By the time the gates opened, her hands had gone cold enough that she had to sit on them to stop the shaking. "You're the ward," said the porter. A thin, silver-eyed man who looked at her the way one might look at a parcel that had arrived slightly damaged. "Marlowe, is it?" "Ivy Marlowe." "Yes. First human through those gates in 11 years. He said it flatly, no particular judgment in his voice, though his eyes lingered a half-second too long on the pulse visible at her throat. "Try not to bleed on anything expensive. I'll do my best." He didn't laugh. Vampires, Ivy would learn very quickly, rarely did. The Great Hall of Ravenscourt was built from black stone and colder ambition, 600 years of vampire nobility's portraits glaring down from the walls, and when Ivy walked in for the welcoming feast, every single head in the room turned at once, the way a field of grass turns when the wind changes. She felt it before she understood it, the low, collective inhale of several hundred vampires all catching, simultaneously, the scent of a human heartbeat walking unescorted into their dining hall. Conversation didn't stop so much as sharpen, hungry and curious, and Ivy made herself walk to the single empty seat reserved at the end of the lowest table without breaking stride, chin up, because her mother had raised her better than to let anyone smell fear on her, human nose or not. "You must be the ward," said the girl seated nearest her, sliding down the bench with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had hair the color of spilled ink and a crest pinned to her collar Ivy didn't recognize. "Isolde Blackwood. I do hope you know how lucky you are. Most humans who walk through these gates don't walk back out of them." "Comforting," Ivy said. "Thank you. I only mean it kindly." Isolde's smile widened, all teeth. And Ivy understood, with the swift clarity of someone who'd grown up reading Rooms for Survival, that nothing about it had been kind at all. The Concord protects you from being drained, Ward. It says nothing about the rest of what a school like this can do to someone who doesn't belong. Ivy was still composing a response when the whole hall went, all at once, very quiet. She felt him before she saw him. A pressure at the back of her skull, ancient and enormous, the way a storm makes itself known long before the first drop falls. She turned, following 400 other gazes, toward the high table at the front of the hall, where a boy who could not possibly have been older than she was stood with the effortless, terrible stillness of something far, far older, wearing very young skin. Lucian Thorne, Isolde murmured, and for the first time all evening, something like genuine caution slid into her voice. Heir to the Thorn Court. Don't stare. He hates being stared at. Ivy hadn't been staring, exactly. She'd been looking, the way one looks at whether that's about to become a problem. He was dark-haired, sharp-jawed, dressed in black that had clearly never been mended because it had never needed to be, and his eyes, when they swept the hall in a slow, bored arc that suggested he found the entire evening beneath him, stopped, without warning, directly on her. Something crossed his face. It happened fast, a flicker, gone before Ivy could name it, somewhere between confusion and alarm, and then he was moving, unhurried, down from the high table and through the crowded hall with the particular ease of someone who had never once had to ask permission to walk anywhere. He's coming this way, Isolde hissed, sitting up straighter, smoothing her hair with the reflexive vanity of someone used to being the reason powerful boys crossed rooms. He wasn't coming for Isolde. He stopped directly in front of Ivy's seat, close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes, and inhaled, slow and deliberate, the way she'd seen wine merchants do over a cork. You're the ward, he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, precise, faintly amused in a way that didn't match the sharp focus in his eyes at all. That's what everyone keeps telling me. You smell wrong. The hall, which had only just begun to remember its own conversations, went silent again. I'm sorry, Ivy said. Human, he said. Mostly. But not entirely. There's something underneath it. His eyes narrowed, and for one unnerving second, she felt genuinely, physically examined, the way she imagined a scholar might examine a manuscript suspected of forgery. Something old. I've smelled it exactly once before. In a book, not a person. That's an extremely strange thing to say to someone you've known for 11 seconds. Something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth. I'm told I have that effect. He straightened, the moment passing as abruptly as it had arrived, and for one breath Ivy thought he might simply walk away and never mention it again. Instead he said, quiet enough that only she and Isolde could hear it. Sleep with your door locked, Ward. And stay away from the East Wing after dark. I don't yet know what you are, but I intend to find out, and I would rather do it before someone else does. Then he was gone, back toward the high table, leaving Ivy sitting very still with her pulse hammering loud enough that she was fairly certain every vampire within 30 feet could hear it, and Isolde staring at her with an expression that had curdled, in the space of one exchange, from mild contempt into something far more dangerous. Well, Isolde said softly. Isn't that interesting? Ivy had absolutely no idea what had just happened. She would spend the next several months finding out, and by the end of it, she would understand that Lucian Thorne's very first words to her had been the truest thing anyone at Ravenscourt Academy ever said. Chapter 2. The Girl Who Smelled Wrong. By the time breakfast arrived the next morning, the entire academy knew that the Thorn heir had crossed the Great Hall to speak to the human ward, and Ivy discovered, with the particular dread of someone who'd spent one evening as background scenery and woken up as the plot, that this was apparently the most interesting thing to happen at Ravenscourt in years. The dormitory hallway outside her room, usually silent at that hour, had acquired an audience of at least 6 students by the time she emerged, all of them pretending, with varying degrees of success, to be doing anything other than watching her walk to breakfast. A second year, she'd never spoken to offered her a shy, unprompted good morning, Ward Marlowe, as though overnight she'd graduated from unremarkable furniture to a person worth greeting by name. Two older students from a rival house went entirely silent as she passed, the particular loaded silence of people rehearsing gossip they intended to finish the moment she was out of earshot. Ivy kept her chin up and her pace even through all of it, doing her best impression of a girl who found the sudden attention tedious rather than terrifying, and made it to the dining hall with her composure only slightly worse for wear. "They're saying he wants to drain you personally," reported Constance Abernathy, the only other student who'd bothered speaking to Ivy without an audience present. Constance was a scholarship vampire from a minor house with no political weight, which made her, in the strange calculus of Ravenscourt's social order, nearly as invisible as Ivy herself, and the two of them had gravitated toward each other with the instinctive relief of two people who understood exactly how little the hall's high table thought of either of them. She had a habit, Ivy was already learning, of narrating the school's gossip in the tone of someone reading aloud from a particularly absurd novel, equal parts horrified and delighted by every new development. "Others are saying he's found some old prophecy that says you're going to end the vampire courts. Someone in my dormitory swears you're a Concord spy sent to poison the water supply. None of that happened. He smelled me and said I smelled wrong and told me to lock my door." Ivy pushed eggs around her plate without eating them. That's the whole encounter. That is, historically, exactly how the worst stories start. Comforting, thank you. I try. Constance leaned in, lowering her voice, glancing once toward the high table where Lucian sat, apparently entirely absorbed in ignoring the room around him, though Ivy noticed his eyes flicked, briefly, toward their corner of the hall before returning to his plate. For what it's worth, Lucian Thorne doesn't do things without reason. He's the coldest person in this school, and I mean that as a professional compliment. He's ranked first in every combat and lineage course for 3 years running, and he has never once, in all that time, spoken to anyone below 4th year status unprompted. If he crossed a crowded hall to talk to you on your first night, it wasn't idle curiosity. That's not making me feel better. It shouldn't. I'm trying to warn you, not comfort you. Constance's expression softened, just slightly. Whatever he smelled, Ivy, it's real. Vampires don't imagine scent. If he says something's under your human blood, something's under your human blood. Ivy thought about that all through her first class, lineage and blood right, taught by a professor so old his voice had gone dry as parchment, and found she couldn't concentrate on a single word of the lecture because the professor's droning list of extinct and near-extinct bloodlines kept snagging, again and again, on a name that meant nothing to her and yet made the hair on her arms rise every time it was spoken. The Dawnborn line, believed extinguished during the purge of the old century, were said to carry blood that could neither be drained nor turned, a resistance so absolute the old courts hunted them nearly to the last child rather than risk what such blood might become in the wrong hands. Ivy raised her hand before she'd fully decided to. "What happened to the last of them?" she asked. "The Dawnborn." The professor's rheumy eyes flicked toward her with mild surprise, as though startled a human had spoken at all. "Officially extinguished. Unofficially, Ward Marlowe. That is precisely the sort of question that gets students noticed by people who would prefer old bloodlines stayed conveniently dead. I'd advise curiosity in private, if you insist on having it at all." The class laughed, politely, the way rooms full of powerful young vampires laughed at things they found beneath genuine amusement, and Ivy sank low in her seat and said nothing else for the rest of the lecture, though the word Dawnborn sat lodged in her chest for the remainder of the day like a splinter she couldn't quite work free. Combat theory, held in a sunken stone ring at the heart of the Academy's western tower, was worse. Humans weren't required to spar. The Concord was explicit on that point. No vampire permitted to draw a human's blood in a training exercise without formal consent, but Ivy had been assigned to observe and record technique for her practical marks, which meant standing at the edge of the ring while Isolde Blackwood, 3 weeks into a very public grudge, decided that observation could be made considerably more educational with a little creative cruelty. Since the ward can't spar, Isolde announced to the instructor, sweet as poison honey. Perhaps she could hold the practice blades. Wouldn't want her to feel left out of the lesson entirely. It was, on its surface, a harmless request. Ivy understood within 4 seconds of picking up the first blade that it had been anything but. The practice weapons were silver-threaded, standard issue for vampire sparring, and the moment her bare hand closed around the hilt, a thin, cold burn raced up her palm that had nothing to do with the metal itself and everything to do with whatever old, unnamed thing lived beneath her human blood reacting, violently, to a substance built specifically to hurt her kind. She didn't drop the blade. She refused, with a stubbornness that would become one of the more consistent features of her time at Ravenscourt, to give Isolde the satisfaction of a reaction, and stood there through the entire lesson with her jaw locked and her palms silently blistering, recording footwork notes in handwriting that only shook a little. "You're bleeding," Constance hissed afterward, grabbing her wrist the moment the class dismissed, turning her palm over to reveal a thin, angry welt already beginning to blister. "Ivy, that's a silver burn. Humans don't get silver burns. That's a vampire reaction. I noticed. You need to see a healer. I need to survive 4 years in this school without anyone else noticing that, Constance, which is going to be considerably harder if I go running to the infirmary every time something in my blood does something it isn't supposed to do." Ivy pulled her sleeve down over the burn, jaw tight. "I'll wrap it myself. Please don't say anything." Constance hadn't liked it, but she'd kept the secret anyway, the way good friends learn to keep the secrets that matter even when they disagree with the decision behind them, and Ivy had spent that whole evening in her dormitory with her palm wrapped in borrowed bandages, turning the burn over in her mind like a puzzle piece that refused to fit any picture she understood yet. She found Lucian that evening in the library, which she would later understand was not a coincidence at all, because the bond of curiosity between them had already been humming quietly since the welcoming feast, and vampires, whatever else they were, had excellent noses for exactly where a person they wanted to find had gone. "You asked about the Dawnborn today," he said, without looking up from the enormous, ancient-looking volume open in front of him. "In Bloodright. You heard about that already? I hear about most things. It's a small school for a large amount of gossip." He finally looked up, and in the candlelight of the library's reading nook, his eyes looked less sharp and more simply tired, like a boy who'd spent years being older than his face. "Why did you ask?" "Because you said I smelled like something you'd only read about in a book. And then a professor mentioned a bloodline that was hunted to extinction specifically because nobody could figure out what to do with it. Call it a hunch." Something flickered across his face. Impressed, maybe, or wary, or both at once. "You're quicker than most humans who come through these gates. I'm quicker than most people, period. It's not a vampire thing." That got the ghost of a smile. He closed the book, careful, deliberate, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. If you're going to keep pulling on this thread regardless of what I tell you, I'd rather you pull on it where I can watch you do it safely." Ivy sat. "So it's true. The Dawnborn." "I don't know yet." He said it honestly, which she appreciated more than a confident lie would have earned. "What I know is that 3 centuries ago, the old vampire courts decided a bloodline of half-human, half-something older hunters posed enough of a threat that they wiped out every family who carried it, down to infants, because the blood itself was said to be dangerous in ways no one fully understood even while they were spilling it. What I know is that last night, I smelled something in your blood that matched a description I've only ever encountered in a single restricted volume in this library, one my own family fought to have sealed rather than destroyed, because destroying knowledge, in my family's experience, tends to guarantee someone eventually needs it again. And you think I'm one of them? A Dawnborn?" "I think," he said carefully, "that it would explain a great deal. Including why a supposedly unremarkable human girl was selected for the ward program this particular year, out of every human territory in the Concord, by a selection committee no one at this school has ever met or been permitted to question." Ivy felt something cold settle low in her stomach. "You think someone chose me on purpose? Because of what I might be? I think it's worth finding out before someone with worse intentions than mine finds out first." He leaned forward, and for the first time since she'd met him, the careful, bored ice in his expression had given way entirely to something focused and intent. "I don't know what you are yet, Ivy Marlowe, but I intend to find out before it costs you your life. Whatever else people say about me in this school, I don't let things I've decided to protect simply die." You've decided to protect me. After one dinner and one library visit. I've decided, he said, that I'm curious enough not to let anyone else get to you first. Call it self-interest, if it's easier to trust. He paused, glancing at the restricted volume still open between them. Its ink faded with age, but its warnings, apparently, undimmed by time. There's something else you should know, before you decide how much of this to trust. My family fought to have that archive sealed rather than burned for a reason that has nothing to do with sentiment. The Thorn Court has old blood of its own, not dawn-born, nothing like what you carry, but old enough that my ancestors remember, in the way old vampire houses remember things, exactly what the purge cost this world, and exactly how little the current courts have learned from it. I'm not telling you this to earn your trust cheaply. I'm telling you because if we're going to do this, investigate, dig, risk whatever's waiting at the bottom of this, you deserve to know I have my own reasons for caring how the story ends, beyond whatever's growing between the two of us. That's oddly formal, for a boy who spent dinner insulting how I smelled. I told you. I'm bad at admitting things plainly. I'm making an exception, apparently, for exactly one subject. The corner of his mouth curved, rueful and honest at once. Don't get used to it. I'll take what I can get. She meant it lightly, but something in her chest, that same traitor warmth from the training ring, settled a little deeper at the admission, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the library's old silence stretching comfortable rather than tense between them, two people who'd known each other barely 2 weeks already settling into something that felt, unaccountably, like it had been there far longer. It wasn't, Ivy thought, watching candlelight move gold across his sharp, careful face, remotely easier to trust. But some traitor part of her, the part that had spent one whole sleepless night replaying 5 sentences from a boy who'd crossed an entire hall just to warn her, found that she wanted to trust it anyway. He found her 3 evenings later in the empty training ring, well past curfew, working through a set of unarmed defensive drills she'd copied, badly, from a manual meant for human border guards, because the silver-threaded practice blades of combat theory had made it painfully clear that whatever weapons the school offered weren't built with her safety in mind. You're doing that wrong, Lucian said, from the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize as his version of amused. I'm doing the best I can with a manual meant for people twice my size and none of my problems. May I? At her nod, he crossed the ring and adjusted her stance with 2 careful touches, a hand at her elbow, another at the small of her back, close enough that she felt, absurdly, her pulse jump the way it hadn't since that very first night in the Great Hall. Your balance is too far forward. If someone actually grabs you, this stance puts you on the ground in half a second. You're offering to teach me combat now. I'm offering, he said, stepping back into a ready stance of his own, to make certain that if anyone else in this school decides to test what your blood does the way a soul did, you're not relying entirely on an involuntary reaction to save you. A burn is useful. It's not a plan. Fair point. She squared her shoulders, mirroring his stance as best she could. Show me properly, then. They worked for the better part of an hour, Lucian patient in a way the rest of the academy would never have believed of him, correcting her footwork, walking her through the particular vulnerabilities of vampires speed created that a humans had to learn to exploit differently, and by the end of it, Ivy was breathless and sweating and, despite everything the last 3 weeks had thrown at her, unexpectedly happy, the kind of simple, physical satisfaction that came from learning something difficult and feeling for the first time in this cold stone school, genuinely competent at it. You're a good teacher, she said, catching her breath against the ring's low wall. I'm told I'm terrible at most forms of patience. Apparently, this is the exception. He handed her a water skin, careful not to let their fingers brush, an old habit of restraint she was beginning to notice he practiced constantly around her, as though he didn't quite trust himself not to want more contact than she'd offered. Same time next week? Assuming neither of us has been murdered by then. Optimistic scheduling for this school. I contain multitudes, he said again, and this time, when she laughed, he let himself smile back at her fully, unguarded, in a way she suspected very few people at Ravenscourt Academy had ever been permitted to see. Chapter 3. What the Blood Remembers. The attack came 9 days later, in the East Wing corridor Lucian had specifically warned her to avoid, on a night Ivy had every intention of avoiding it right up until Isolde Blackwood's roommate arrived at her door in tears claiming Constance had been taken ill in the East Wing infirmary and needed her. It was, Ivy understood almost immediately upon arrival, an obvious trap. She understood it exactly 4 seconds too late to do anything useful about it. She should have questioned it sooner. Constance had been perfectly well at dinner 3 hours earlier, complaining cheerfully about an essay on interhouse diplomacy she hadn't started and had no intention of starting before the deadline forced her hand. But fear, Ivy would learn that night, had a way of overriding good sense entirely. The girl at her door had been genuinely, convincingly distressed, wringing her hands, insisting there wasn't time to fetch a proper healer. That Constance had asked for Ivy specifically, and Ivy, half asleep and entirely unwilling to risk her only real friend at this school over an abundance of caution, had thrown a robe over her nightclothes and followed without a second thought. She noticed, halfway down the East Wing's unlit corridor, that the girl who'd fetched her had somehow vanished from beside her without either of them exchanging a single word since leaving the dormitory. She noticed, a moment after that the corridor's usual night lanterns had all been extinguished, every single one. In a hallway the Academy prided itself on keeping lit for exactly the kind of human safety the Concord demanded. She noticed both of these things at almost precisely the moment the infirmary door came into view, half open, a single candle guttering weakly inside, and by then it was already far too late to turn back the way she'd come. The East Wing infirmary was empty, lit by that single guttering candle, and the door slammed shut behind her the moment she crossed the threshold, sealed by a ward she felt rather than saw, a pressure against her skin like a held breath. "Hello, Ward," said a voice from the shadows, and Isolde Blackwood stepped into the candlelight with 2 upperclassmen flanking her, all 3 of them wearing the particular hungry stillness Ivy had learned, in 9 short days, meant a vampire was actively fighting the urge to stop being polite. "Constance isn't here," Ivy said, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. "Constance is fine. Constance is, in fact, asleep in her own bed, entirely unaware her name got used for something useful tonight." Isolde circled her, slow, unhurried, savoring it. "I've been patient, Ward. I let Lucian have his little curiosity for over a week now, hoping it would burn itself out the way his curiosities usually do. It hasn't. He's been in the restricted archive 4 nights running. He stopped attending half his usual engagements. And you," her eyes narrowed, sharp and hungry, "you've been walking around this school for over a week wearing something under your skin that has every old house in this academy whispering about bloodlines that were supposed to be extinct. Do you understand what that means for someone like me?" "I genuinely don't. It means the Thorn heir, who was promised to my house 11 years ago, who my family has spent a decade positioning me to secure, has suddenly decided a human charity case is more interesting than a betrothal that would have made my house one of the most powerful in the Western courts." Isolde's fangs had lengthened, visible now even through her forced, brittle smile. "So, I'd like to know exactly what's in your blood, Ward. And I'd like to know it before Lucian does. You're going to bite me to find out. I'm going to taste you," Isolde corrected almost gently, "because that's the only reliable way any of us actually confirm bloodline the old way, and because, frankly, I've been curious myself since the moment you walked into that hall smelling like something none of us could quite name." Ivy backed toward the wall, mind racing, pulse hammering loud enough she was certain every vampire in the room could hear it as clearly as a drum. The Concord protects wards from being drained. That's the whole point of the program. The Concord protects you from being drained to death. Isolde's smile went sharp and terrible. "A taste isn't death, Ward. It's just curiosity with teeth." She lunged. Ivy didn't have time to think, only to react, twisting hard against the wall exactly as Isolde's fangs came for her throat, catching a mouthful of her shoulder instead of the artery she'd been aiming for, and the sound Isolde made, the instant her blood hit her tongue, was not triumph. It was pain. Isolde recoiled, gasping, clutching her own mouth like she'd bitten into something burning, and the 2 upperclassmen flanking her froze, alarmed, watching their housemate stumble backward with blood. Ivy's blood, smoking faintly, impossibly, against her lips. What, Isolde gasped, was that? The door tore open behind them before anyone could answer. The ward Ivy had felt sealing it earlier shattering like glass under a force she felt in her back teeth, and Lucian Thorne stood in the doorway with an expression that made the two upperclassmen bolt on instinct, animal and immediate, leaving Isolde alone against a wall she suddenly looked far too young and far too frightened to be standing near. "Get out," Lucian said, very quietly, in a voice that carried more danger in 2 words than Isolde had managed in a full 10 minutes of theater. "Now, Isolde. Before I decide your family's standing isn't worth the restraint I'm currently exercising." Isolde fled. Ivy would learn later that she never fully explained to anyone what she'd tasted in that room, and that the burn along her lips took nearly a week to fully heal, and that from that night forward, Isolde Blackwood crossed to the far side of any corridor Ivy walked down, the way one avoids a fire that has already proven it can hurt. Lucian crossed the room in 3 strides and caught Ivy before her knees fully gave out, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other pressed careful and urgent against the wound at her shoulder. "Let me see," he said, low, and when she tilted her head enough to let him, he went very still, nostrils flaring, eyes fixed on the shallow bite with an intensity that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with fear. "It burned her," Ivy said, voice shaking now that the adrenaline had started to ebb. "Why did it burn her?" "Because I was right." His voice had gone rough, almost reverent. "Ivy, your blood isn't just resistant to draining. It's actively hostile to a vampire bite, the way old texts describe dawnborn blood reacting to anyone trying to take it by force rather than by choice." He met her eyes, something fierce and careful moving behind his own. "You're not just descended from them. I think you might be one of the last of them, full and complete, which means whoever selected you for this ward program either didn't know what they were sending into this school or knew exactly what they were sending, and wanted to hear for reasons that have nothing to do with the Concord at all." Ivy's head was spinning, blood loss and fear, and the enormity of everything he'd just said tangling together into something she couldn't fully process yet. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, gathering her carefully against his chest, one arm under her knees before she could protest, "I get you somewhere safe, and I find out exactly who put your name on that selection list, and I make certain nobody in this school ever gets close enough to taste your blood again, without your permission." His jaw was tight, his voice low and fierce against her hair as he carried her from the room. "I told you the first night I met you. I don't let things I've decided to protect simply die. You've known me 9 days. "I know," he said, quiet, almost surprised by his own conviction. "I don't have a good explanation for it either. I just know it's true." Ivy, dizzy and bleeding and held against a boy the entire academy feared more than anything else within its walls, found she believed him completely. Chapter 3.5. The Weight of a Borrowed Name. Before the attack, before the archive, before any of it, there had been a single ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day Ivy would later think back on as the last one where her life had still, technically, belonged to her. When she'd gone looking for Constance in the small, dusty scholarship dormitory tucked behind the academy's kitchens, and found her friend hunched over a genealogy assignment with the particular despair of someone whose family tree had exactly 4 interesting branches and 11 boring ones. "Tell me something useful about your family," Constance had said, not looking up. "Mine's put me to sleep twice already." "There's nothing useful to tell. My mother died when I was 6. My father raised me on stories that don't check out against any record office in the territory. I used to think that was just because we were poor and nobody bothered keeping proper records for families like mine." Ivy had settled onto the end of Constance's bed, picking at a loose thread on the blanket. "Now I'm starting to wonder if it's because somebody made sure the records didn't exist. That's an ominous thing to say on a Tuesday. I've had an ominous month." It had felt, at the time, like an exaggeration. Looking back on it later, Ivy would think it had actually been something of an understatement. It hadn't seemed important then. A passing complaint, the kind of thing lonely children said about parents they'd lost too young to properly remember. But after the welcoming feast, after Lucian's strange, precise warning, after the word Dawnborn had lodged itself under her ribs like a splinter, Ivy had gone back through the one box of her father's belongings she'd been permitted to bring to Ravenscourt and found, tucked into the lining of an old traveling case, a small brass locket she'd never once seen him wear. Inside it, a curl of dark hair that wasn't hers, and a single line of old script, half-worn from handling, that she hadn't been able to read at all until Lucian, turning it over carefully in the library candlelight 2 nights after the attack, went very still. "This is an old dialect," he said. "Pre-Concord. Almost nobody reads it fluently anymore outside the restricted archive." He traced the faded letters with one careful finger. "It says, roughly, 'Let the dawn remember what the courts forgot.' It's not decoration, Ivy. It's a naming phrase. The kind of thing a Dawnborn family would have inscribed on an heirloom meant to be passed down in secret, generation to generation, long after they stopped being able to say the word Dawnborn out loud without risking their lives." Ivy had stared at the locket, throat tight, thinking of a father who'd never once told her why they moved so often, why he'd flinched, always, at any conversation involving the vampire courts, why he'd made her memorize an emergency route out of every town they'd ever lived in before she'd even learned her letters. "He knew," she said quietly. "My whole life. He knew what we were, and he never told me." "He was protecting you," Lucian said, gentle in a way that still, weeks later, caught her off guard every time it surfaced from underneath his careful, dangerous exterior. "If even half of what the archive suggests about the Purge is true, knowing what you were as a child would have made you a target the moment anyone with the right nose got close enough to notice. He kept you alive by keeping you ignorant. That's not a small thing to have done for someone, even if it left you with more questions than answers now. It doesn't feel like enough. Whatever he was protecting me from found me anyway. It found you at 17, walking confidently into the most dangerous building in 3 territories, instead of at 7, alone and unprotected in some human village with no one who understood what you were or how to keep you safe." Lucian closed his hand gently over hers, over the locket. "I'd call that protection working exactly as long as it needed to." Ivy hadn't cried, not then. Not in a library with its watching portraits and its centuries of careful vampire dignity, but she'd held onto that thought, held onto the locket, and carried both of them into every difficult conversation that followed, a small brass anchor against everything Ravenscourt kept trying to make her doubt about her own right to exist within its walls. Chapter 4. The Archive of Extinguished Names. She spent 3 days in the infirmary recovering, and by the time she was cleared to return to classes, the entire academy had rearranged itself, once again, around her existence, though this time, the whispers had shifted from mockery to something closer to fear. "They're saying you burned a souled Blackwood's mouth just by existing," Constance reported, arriving at Ivy's bedside with an armful of books and the grim delight of someone who'd finally found herself adjacent to a genuinely good scandal. "There's a rumor you're a sealed weapon the human territories smuggled in to assassinate the vampire courts from the inside. Another one says you're secretly Lucian's intended, and Isolde attacked you out of jealousy, which, honestly, given how he's been sitting outside this infirmary for 3 days straight glaring at anyone who walks past, I'm inclined to believe that one a little." "He's been outside for 3 days?" "On and off. Mostly on." Constance's expression softened.
"Ivy.
Whatever's actually happening here, I want you to know I don't care what bloodline you're from. You're still the only person at this school who laughed at my terrible joke about the dean's wig in the first week. That matters more to me than 300-year-old politics." Ivy's throat went tight. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just don't die." "I've grown attached, which is inconvenient, because everyone at this school who gets interesting eventually gets targeted, and I'd rather not lose the one friend here who doesn't require constant management of an ancient family ego." When Lucian was finally allowed in, he came bearing a stack of books nearly as tall as Constance's, and an expression of controlled, simmering fury that hadn't fully faded since the night in the East Wing. "I found something," he said, without preamble, setting the books down and pulling the top volume open to a page marked with a strip of black ribbon. The Dawnborn weren't simply hunted for what their blood could resist. They were hunted because of what it could do in the right circumstances to certain kinds of old, powerful magic.
Wards. Seals.
binding spells cast centuries ago and never meant to be broken. He turned the book toward her, revealing a hand-inked illustration of a sealed door bound in old, tangled script. There's a binding beneath this academy, Ivy, older than the school itself. It seals something the founding courts decided was too dangerous to ever wake. Nobody living knows exactly what. The records were deliberately vague, which in my family's experience means it was genuinely catastrophic. And the binding, according to this text, was cast using Dawnborn blood as its anchor, which means Dawnborn blood, in sufficient quantity, could also be used to break it. Ivy stared at the illustration, cold dread climbing her spine. You think that's why I was selected? Not to prove the Concord still works. To be, what, a key? I think someone believes you could be used as one. Whether that's true or not, whether you'd even survive the attempt, I don't know, and frankly I don't intend to find out by letting anyone close enough to try. His jaw tightened. I've been through the ward selection records twice now. They were altered. Someone with archive access replaced the committee's original shortlist with your name alone, 6 weeks before the program's formal announcement. That's not bureaucratic error, Ivy. That's a deliberate, careful hand, someone with enough standing in this school to touch sealed records without anyone questioning it. Isolde. Isolde is petty and cruel, but she's not clever enough for something this careful, and she was as surprised as anyone by what your blood did to her. He hesitated, and something darker moved behind his eyes. I think it's someone higher. A professor. A member of the Dean's Court, possibly. Someone who's had access to that sealed binding record for years and has been waiting patiently for the right blood to walk through these gates. Ivy pulled her knees up to her chest, the infirmary blanket suddenly feeling thin against a fear that had nothing to do with fever. So, I'm not just the only human at the school. I'm bait someone's been quietly setting for a trap that's been baking for 3 centuries. You're not bait. Lucian's voice went fierce, immediate. You're a person, Ivy, whatever your blood happens to be capable of, and I am not going to let this school treat you like a key to be turned by whoever's patient enough to reach for you first. He reached out, careful, and took her hand, thumb moving slow and grounding over her knuckles. I know we didn't choose any of this. I know 9 days ago you'd never even heard the word Dawnborn, and now you're lying in an infirmary bed discovering your blood might be the anchor to some ancient catastrophe sealed under the school. But I meant what I said the night I found you bleeding in that corridor. I'm not letting anyone use you. Not for a binding, not for a bloodline, not for anything. They spent the following week, once Ivy was cleared to leave the infirmary, doing exactly what Lucian had promised, quietly, carefully, pulling every thread the sealed binding record off for them. It was slower and less glamorous than Ivy had imagined investigations of ancient conspiracies would be. Mostly it meant long evenings in the restricted archive's outer reading room, surrounded by towers of borrowed texts, Constance smuggling in tea and gossip in equal measure, while Lucian cross-referenced old court correspondence against dates, names, and the particular administrative fingerprints of whoever had altered the ward selection records. Look at this, Lucian said, one such evening, sliding a ledger across the table toward her. Every major addition to the restricted archive over the past decade has gone through the same authorization signature. Voss's, technically, he's the archive keeper, it should be his signature on everything. But look at the ink. Ivy squinted at the page. The signatures, spaced months apart, were subtly different, pressure, slant, the particular loop of the V, inconsistent in a way that suggested, unmistakably, more than one hand behind the same name. Someone's been signing as him, she said slowly. Or he's been signing under instruction, copying a style that isn't naturally his, which would explain the inconsistency without requiring an outright forger in the mix. Lucian tapped the ledger. Either way, it confirms what I suspected. Voss isn't operating alone, and hasn't been for years. Whoever's guiding him has been patient enough and careful enough to leave almost no trace beyond these small, telling inconsistencies. How do we prove it's connected to me specifically? All of this could just be academy politics. Old vampire houses squabbling over archive access. Because 6 weeks before your name appeared on the ward shortlist, Lucian said, quiet and grim. There's a requisition here, signed with that same inconsistent hand, for 3 obscure genealogical texts on extinguished bloodlines, texts that hadn't been requested from this archive in over 40 years, according to the sign-out record. Someone went looking for exactly the kind of blood you carry, Ivy, months before your name was ever supposed to be relevant to anyone in this building. Ivy sat back, cold settling deep in her chest despite the reading room's carefully banked fire. So, it wasn't luck. It wasn't even really the Concord selecting me at all. No, Lucian agreed. I think the Concord process was hijacked quietly and thoroughly by someone who already knew, or at least strongly suspected, exactly what you were before you ever set foot on that mountain road. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, steady despite the grim weight of what they'd just uncovered. Which means whatever comes next, we're not dealing with opportunists reacting to a discovery. We're dealing with people who've been planning this for years, and who are not going to give up simply because their first attempt through Voss failed. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. It's meant to keep both of us careful. His thumb moved, slow, over her knuckles. But you're not facing it with less information than they have anymore, and you're not facing it alone. That has to count for something, even against people who've had a decade's head start. It was, Ivy thought, watching candlelight catch gold in his careful, focused eyes, considerably more comfort than the words themselves technically offered, and somehow, entirely enough anyway. Why do you care this much? Ivy asked, quiet, genuinely bewildered. You didn't know me before 9 days ago either. Something vulnerable crossed his careful, guarded face, gone almost as fast as it arrived. I've spent my whole life being exactly what my house needed me to be. Cold, controlled, feared, because feared is safer than liked in a court like mine. You walked into that hall on your first night and looked more annoyed by the attention than impressed by it, and it's the first time in years anyone in this school has looked at me like a person instead of a title. He exhaled, rough. I don't fully understand what's happening between us either. I just know I'd rather face whatever's coming standing next to you than watch from a safe, cowardly distance while someone else decides what to do with your blood. Ivy's chest went tight with something that had nothing to do with fear at all. That's a lot to admit in an infirmary. I'm told I'm bad at admitting things anywhere else. The ghost of a smile, warm despite everything. I'm making an exception. She leaned forward, slow, giving him every chance to pull back, and when he didn't, she closed the distance and kissed him, careful of nothing in particular except her own racing heart, and felt him go still with surprise before one hand came up, gentle, to cradle her jaw, kissing her back like she was something rare and worth being careful with. Well, he said, when she finally pulled back, voice rough. That answers a question I'd been too much of a coward to ask. Don't get used to it. We still have an ancient binding and a school full of suspects to deal with. I'm aware. He didn't let go of her hand. I intend to deal with both, starting tonight. But I wanted you to know, before either of us walks back into danger, exactly where I stand. Ivy looked at him. Dangerous, careful, unexpectedly gentle underneath every layer of ice the school had taught him to wear, and thought, with a fierce and unfamiliar certainty, that whatever waited beneath Ravenscourt Academy, she was no longer facing it alone. Chapter 5. The Hand Behind the Seal. The trail led, eventually, exactly where Lucian had suspected it might, to Professor Aldrich Voss, keeper of the restricted archive, a soft-spoken, unassuming man Ivy had passed in corridors a dozen times without a single flicker of suspicion, whose office, when Lucian finally gained access to it under cover of a legitimate research request, held a locked cabinet whose contents made both of them go cold. Getting into that office had taken careful planning of its own. Lucian had spent 2 days cultivating a plausible excuse, a genuine research request tied to his family's own archive holdings, the kind of errand no one at Ravenscourt would think twice about a Thorn air running, while Constance, delighted beyond measure to finally be useful to the conspiracy she'd been agitating over for weeks, kept watch in the corridor outside with a stack of borrowed books and a cover story about returning overdue loans. You have 10 minutes, Constance had hissed through the half-open door. Voss has staff meetings on Thursdays, but they never run long, and if I have to keep pretending to be lost in this corridor for longer than that, I'm going to attract exactly the wrong kind of attention. 10 minutes is plenty, Lucian had said, already crossing to the locked cabinet behind Voss's desk, a small charm-etched pick materializing in his hand with the ease of someone who'd clearly done this sort of thing before, whatever his family's official position on breaking into a colleague's private records might technically be. Inside, the original, unaltered ward selection shortlist, 6 names crossed out in careful ink, Ivy's circled twice. A private correspondence, coded but not coded well enough to survive Lucian's family training in old cipher work, referencing a final anchor and a restoration long overdue. And, at the very back, a small, sealed vial of something dark and old that made every instinct in Ivy's borrowed, half-understood blood recoil the moment she got close enough to see it. He's not working alone, Lucian said grimly, photographing the correspondence with a charm-etched glass plate before carefully returning everything to its place. This references a patron. Someone outside the academy, funding the search, patient enough to wait 3 centuries for the right blood to surface. Voss is the hand. He's not the mind behind it. Then we tell the dean. We tell the dean, and the moment we do, whoever Voss answers to knows we're onto them, and they move up whatever timeline they've been operating on. Lucian's jaw tightened. I'd rather have proof of the patron before we spook the person actually pulling strings. Voss alone we can contain. Voss with an unknown ally still free to try again somewhere else. That's a threat we can't close the door on. They didn't get the chance to choose their timing. Voss found them in his own office 3 nights later, catching them mid-search, and the confrontation that followed was neither clever nor slow. It was fast, brutal, and nearly fatal. Voss's magic far older and far more vicious than his mild, bookish exterior had ever suggested, binding spells crackling silver-white across the office as Lucian threw himself bodily between Ivy and the first strike meant for her chest. You don't understand what you're interfering with, Voss snarled, circling, robes snapping, all pretense of gentleness gone. That binding beneath this school has held back something that nearly destroyed the Western courts 300 years ago. It weakens every year. It needs renewal, and renewal needs dawnborn blood, freely given or otherwise, and I will not let sentiment cost this academy the only anchor strong enough to hold that seal another 3 centuries. You'd kill her for it, Lucian said, low and furious, blood already welling from a gash along his forearm where he'd taken the blow meant for Ivy. I'd save thousands for it, Voss corrected and lunged. Ivy didn't think. She'd learned, in the space of 1 terrifying month, exactly what her blood did to a vampire who tried to take it by force. And she stepped forward instead of back, catching Voss's wrist as his hand closed around her arm, and felt the same reaction Isolde had suffered ignite along his skin the instant his intent turned violent. A burn, sharp and immediate, magic recoiling against magic, old blood refusing, absolutely and completely, to be taken rather than given. Voss screamed and staggered back, clutching a hand that smoked faintly at the fingertips, and in the half-second of his distraction, Lucian was on him, pinning him hard against the wall of his own office with a strength Ivy had never seen him use before, something ancient and terrible moving behind his usually careful eyes. "Who is your patron?" Lucian said, very quietly, which was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "Give me the name, Voss, or I promise you the courts will hear exactly what you attempted here tonight, and my family's testimony alone will be enough to end whatever's left of your standing in this academy." Voss, cornered, bleeding, his careful mask finally, fully shattered, gave up the name in a whisper laced with genuine terror, a name Ivy didn't recognize, tied to a court far to the north that had, according to Lucian's grim, tightening expression, been quietly gathering old bloodline knowledge for over a decade under the guise of academic preservation. Academy guards arrived within minutes, summoned by a charm Lucian had triggered the moment the confrontation began, and Voss was led away in silver-threaded restraints, his careful, mild-mannered composure entirely gone, replaced by something hollow and defeated that Ivy found she couldn't quite bring herself to feel triumphant about, even knowing what he'd intended to do to her. You're allowed to feel complicated about it, Lucian said quietly, watching her watch the guards disappear down the corridor with their prisoner. He's still a person who made a terrible choice, not a monster from a children's story. It's all right, if that's harder to sit with than pure relief would be. I keep thinking about what he said, that he'd save thousands. Ivy wrapped her arms around herself, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, leaving something colder and more thoughtful in its place. What if he wasn't entirely wrong? What if that binding really is failing, and what if the only way to save it really does need blood like mine? Then we find a way to renew it that doesn't require carving you open on an altar some professor thinks is justified by good intentions. Lucian's voice was firm, certain, brooking no argument. There's always a difference, Ivy, between something being true and something justifying whatever cruelty someone's decided is necessary because of it. If that binding genuinely needs attention, we get people we trust to study it properly, carefully, with your consent and your safety built into every step. We do not let anyone else decide, on your behalf, that your life is an acceptable price for someone else's convenience. This isn't over, Lucian added, releasing his grip on the doorframe he'd been holding, his hand finding Ivy's, steady despite the blood still welling along his arm. But it's contained for tonight. Voss won't be trying anything else from inside these walls. And the patron? Is a problem for after we've both had time to breathe. He looked at her, something fierce and relieved and entirely unguarded in his expression. You're bleeding. So are you. Rather more, actually. I've had worse. The corner of his mouth twitched, exhausted but genuine. You just walked toward a vampire trying to kill you and let your own blood burn him. That was either the bravest or most reckless thing I've watched anyone do in this school, and I include my own family history in that assessment. I've been told I run toward danger instead of away from it. Apparently, it's a personality flaw. It's not a flaw. He pulled her, careful of both their injuries, into a tired, grateful embrace. It's the reason we're both still standing here to have this conversation. Don't apologize for it. Chapter 6. What the Dawn Remembers. The Academy's formal inquiry into Professor Voss's actions took the better part of a week, conducted with a particular slow, careful gravity vampire institutions reserved for scandals large enough to threaten their standing with the human territories. Ivy testified twice, Lucian once, Isolde, stripped, in the aftermath, of most of the social standing she'd once wielded so casually, was called upon to confirm what her own burned mouth had already proven to half the school. Isolde found Ivy alone in the East Garden 2 days after the inquiry closed, and Ivy, bracing on instinct for another round of cold cruelty, was startled to find the girl's usual sharp composure entirely absent, replaced by something smaller and more uncertain than Ivy had ever seen on her. I'm not here to apologize, Isolde said, stopping a careful distance away, arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. I don't think I know how, honestly. My house doesn't really teach that particular skill. That's an oddly honest way to open a conversation. I've had a strange month. Isolde's mouth twisted, something bitter and self-aware in it. I attacked you because I thought you'd cost me a betrothal I'd spent 10 years being groomed to secure, and it turns out the whole time, my own family knew exactly what the ward selection committee was actually doing, and let me walk into this school utterly ignorant of it, because informing me might have meant I asked questions they didn't want answered. She looked briefly, achingly young. I've spent a week finding out my own house has been quietly aware of the Northern Court's interest in Dawnborn blood for years. I didn't know. I want that believed, even if I don't especially deserve to be believed after how I treated you. Ivy considered her for a long moment, the girl who'd burned her mouth trying to taste secrets that weren't hers to take, who'd spent a month being cruel out of a fear Ivy now understood a little better than she wanted to. I believe you didn't know, she said finally. That doesn't erase what you did. But I understand a little what it's like to find out the people who raised you kept things from you that changed everything about how you understood your own life. That's more grace than I gave you. I'm aware. Ivy allowed herself the smallest, thin smile. I'm not offering forgiveness today, Isolde. I don't think I'm there yet, but I'm not interested in carrying this feud through 3 more years of shared classes either, if you're genuinely done starting them. I'm done, Isolde said, quiet and, for the first time since Ivy had met her, entirely without artifice. For what it's worth. It wasn't friendship, not yet, and possibly not ever, but it was, Ivy thought, watching Isolde walk away across the darkening courtyard, something considerably more honest than anything that had passed between them before, and honest, at Ravenscourt Academy, had turned out to be a rarer and more valuable currency than Ivy had ever expected to find within its walls. By the time the dean announced Voss's expulsion and formal remand to the northern courts for further questioning about his unnamed patron, Ravenscourt Academy had, once again, entirely rearranged itself around Ivy's existence, though this time, the whispers had settled into something closer to careful, wary respect. "They're calling you the last Dawnborn now," Constance reported, sliding into the seat beside Ivy at breakfast with a grin that had lost none of its mischief despite the last month's chaos. "Which is a significant upgrade from Concord Spy, I'll have you know. There's already a betting pool on whether the dean offers you a permanent place here instead of sending you home at the end of your ward term. There's a betting pool on everything at this school. It's how we cope with living somewhere this dramatic. You'd know, you've become the drama." Constance's grin softened into something more genuine. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're still here to be gossiped about. I was fairly certain for about 4 days there that you wouldn't be. So was I, honestly." The dean, when Ivy was finally called to a private audience the following week, turned out to be neither the cold, ancient figure her imagination had built nor the distant, disinterested administrator the Academy's rumor mill had suggested, but a tired, watchful woman named Headmistress Ashworth, who studied Ivy for a long moment across a wide oak desk before speaking at all. "I owe you a formal apology on behalf of this institution," she said finally, "which I recognize does very little to undo what you've survived within these walls. The ward program was meant to be a bridge between our courts and the human territories. Instead, it was quietly turned into a hunting ground by a member of my own staff, operating for years under my nose, and you are the one who paid the price for that failure of oversight. I'd rather have an honest accounting than a comfortable one," Ivy said. "So, thank you for that, at least. You're remarkably composed for someone who's spent a month being hunted. I've had help." Ivy didn't elaborate, but something in the headmistress's expression suggested she didn't need to. "What happens now? To the ward program? To me?" "The program will be suspended pending a full review, likely for several years, until the human territories and this academy can rebuild enough trust to justify sending another ward through these gates at all." The headmistress folded her hands. "As for you, Miss Marlowe, that is rather more your decision than mine. You could return to the human territories at the end of this term, under full Concord protection, with a formal acknowledgement of the harm done to you and resources to help you understand your bloodline on your own terms, away from every political interest currently circling it. Or, if you wished it, this academy could offer you a place as a full student rather than a ward, protection, resources, and a proper education in exactly what you are alongside the courts that have, admittedly, given you very little reason to trust them so far." Ivy thought of her father's locket, of a childhood spent fleeing questions she'd never known she carried the answers to, of Constance's steady, undemanding friendship and Lucian's hand finding hers in every dark corridor this school had thrown at her. "I'd like to stay," she said. "On my own terms. Not as a ward. Not as an experiment. As a student who happens to be the last of something old, and who intends to understand exactly what that means before anyone else gets to decide it for me." "Then it will be done," the headmistress said, something that might almost have been approval in her ancient, careful eyes. "Welcome to Ravenscourt Academy properly, Miss Marlowe. I suspect you'll make the place considerably more interesting than it's been in quite some time." Chapter 7. The Name Behind the Glove. The Northern Patron did not stay hidden for long. It took the headmistress's investigators 11 days to trace the coded correspondence Lucian had photographed in Voss's office back through 3 false fronts and 1 dissolved trading company to its true source, Lord Ambrose Kestrel, a minor court elder from the northern reaches who had spent the better part of a decade quietly funding academic preservation societies that were, on closer inspection, nothing more than a network for hunting exactly the kind of bloodline knowledge the old purge had supposedly erased for good. Kestrel had never set foot on Ravenscourt's grounds himself. He hadn't needed to. He'd simply found a frightened, ambitious archive keeper willing to do the work in exchange for promises of standing in a northern court that had never intended to honor them. "He's not going to come quietly," Lucian said, spreading the investigators' findings across the reading room table for Ivy, Constance, and the headmistress to review together. A courtesy Ivy suspected the headmistress extended more out of respect for what Ivy had already survived than any formal obligation. Kestrel spent 10 years building deniability into every layer of this. Voss's arrest will have already reached him. "Which means he does one of two things," the headmistress said grimly. "Goes to ground and tries again through some other patient fool in a decade. Or decides the investment's too valuable to abandon and comes for the anchor directly, while he still believes he has surprise on his side." "He doesn't have surprise," Ivy said. "We know his name. We know what he wants. If he's coming anyway, I'd rather it happen on ground we've chosen, with people I trust standing between him and whatever he's planning, than wait years wondering when he decides the moment's right." It took another careful week to set the trap. A false rumor, leaked through channels the investigators confirmed led back toward Kestrel's remaining contacts, suggesting the binding was failing faster than believed, and that the headmistress was quietly considering a voluntary renewal ritual using willing Dawnborn blood before the structure could be properly secured. It was a considerable risk dressed as bait, and every safeguard around Ivy that night needed to hold without a single gap. They held. Kestrel came the night of the false renewal, exactly as the leaked rumor had promised, arriving not through the front gates, but through an old smuggler's passage beneath the chapel that even the headmistress had needed Voss's confiscated archive notes to locate, proof, if anyone had still needed it, that his interest in Ravenscourt's hidden architecture long predated his interest in Ivy specifically. He came with 2 hired blades and a confidence that shattered the moment he stepped into the sealed chamber beneath the chapel and found not an unguarded girl mid-ritual, but the headmistress's own senior guard, Lucian at Ivy's side rather than absent from it, and Ivy herself standing very deliberately in the open, unafraid, exactly where she'd chosen to be rather than where anyone had placed her. "You're supposed to be alone," Kestrel said, and for the first time, the polished, patient cruelty in his voice cracked into something closer to panic. "I've stopped being alone with anything, Lord Kestrel," Ivy said. That was rather the point of setting this trap. The fight that followed was brief and, thanks to the headmistress's guard, decisively one-sided. Kestrel's hired blades were captured within minutes, and Kestrel himself, cornered and finally, fully exposed, made one last desperate lunge toward Ivy that ended the way every such attempt against her had ended since the night in the East Wing Infirmary, with old, furious blood refusing, absolutely, to be taken by force, burning across his grasping hand hard enough that he went down screaming, before Lucian's own strike ever landed. "It's over," Lucian said, quiet and fierce, pulling Ivy back against his chest as the guards moved in to bind Kestrel properly.
"Ivy.
It's actually over." The formal reckoning took another month to complete. Kestrel's arrest sparked a genuine crisis across the Northern Court, forcing a public reckoning with exactly how much old Purge-era hunting apparatus had quietly survived, disguised, into the present era, and the resulting treaty amendments closed, permanently, the loopholes that had allowed the ward selection process to be hijacked in the first place. Voss, already remanded for his own role, testified fully once Kestrel's arrest made continued loyalty pointless, and between the 2 confessions, the courts finally had enough to guarantee no similar hunt could be quietly assembled again without triggering immediate, binding intervention from every signatory territory. As for the binding itself, the true one, sealed centuries ago beneath Ravenscourt's oldest stone, a proper study, conducted over the following weeks by scholars Ivy herself helped select, confirmed what Lucian had promised Voss that terrible night in his office. The seal did not, in fact, require blood taken by force, or even blood spent all at once. It required renewal, carefully and rarely, freely offered by willing Dawnborn descent, in a ritual that cost the giver nothing more than a single evening and left the ancient magic humming steady and secure for another century at least. Ivy performed that renewal herself, 3 weeks after Kestrel's capture, surrounded by people who had earned the right to stand in that chamber with her. Lucian, Constance, even Isolde. Invited at Ivy's own insistence, standing quiet and genuinely humbled at the edge of the circle, and felt, when the old magic settled warm and grateful beneath her palm, not exploitation, but something closer to purpose freely chosen. There was nothing left hunting her when it was done. No hidden patron. No altered record waiting to be discovered. No shadow beneath the school with her name on it. There was only Ravenscourt Academy, quiet again, and a future she had, for the first time in her life, actually chosen for herself. Lucian found her later that evening in the East Garden, a small, walled courtyard behind the old chapel Ivy had discovered during her infirmary recovery, quiet and green even in the Vampire Academy's perpetual dusk, the one place at Ravenscourt that had never once felt like it was watching her. "I heard," he said, settling onto the bench beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, "about the headmistress's offer. And your answer." Word travels fast in this school. Word travels fast when the person it's about matters this much to me. He said it simply, without embarrassment, in the particular unguarded way he'd only ever seemed to find with her, out here, away from every watching portrait and whispering corridor. "I'm glad you're staying. I wasn't going to ask you to. That felt like exactly the kind of pressure you've had enough of from everyone else in this building, but I'm glad regardless." "You weren't going to ask me to stay? I was going to support whatever you chose, even if it meant a very long correspondence between here and wherever the human territories decided to keep you safest." Something rueful crossed his face. I'd already worked out 3 different excuses my family could use to justify me visiting the human territories regularly, in case it came to that. I wasn't going to let distance be the reason this ended, whatever you decided. Ivy laughed, surprised out of her, warm despite the enormity of the months behind them. "You planned excuses. In advance. Before you even knew what I'd choose. I told you. I contain multitudes. Most of them involve being embarrassingly thorough about things I've decided matter to me." He caught her hand, thumb moving slow over her knuckles, the same gesture she'd already come to think of as entirely, uniquely his. "For what it's worth, Ivy Marlowe. I meant every word I told you in that infirmary all those weeks ago. I don't regret any of this. Not the ward selection, not the attack, not Kestrel, not one single complicated, terrifying, occasionally wonderful day since you walked into that hall smelling like something none of us could name. You can finally say that without a threat still hanging over both our heads." I noticed. His mouth curved, warm and unguarded. "It's a considerably better feeling than I expected. I'd gotten so used to loving you with a conspiracy attached, I wasn't entirely sure what it would feel like without one." "Loving me?" Ivy repeated, something in her chest going bright and unsteady at the words said so plainly, without hedging, without the careful deflection he'd worn like armor the first weeks she'd known him. "I said it wrong 3 months ago, the night I found you bleeding in that infirmary corridor, and called it decided to protect instead because it felt safer than the truth." Lucian turned to face her fully. Every trace of the school's feared ice air gone from his expression, leaving only the boy underneath it, plain and certain. "I love you, Ivy Marlowe. Not because of what your blood can do for a binding, or because of what surviving Kestrel proved about either of us. Because you walked into this school terrified and ordinary-looking and refused, every single day since, to be anything other than exactly yourself, even when half this academy tried to make you into a weapon, a key, or a scandal instead." "You know," Ivy said, watching the last of the evening light fade gold and violet over the garden's high stone walls, throat tight with something too full to entirely be words, "a few months ago, I thought the most dangerous thing about this school was going to be surviving dinner without anyone noticing my pulse. I didn't expect ancient bloodlines, or attempted murder, or a corrupt northern lord, or—" She gestured loosely between them. "This. You. Any of it." "None of us expected any of it," Lucian agreed. "I've decided I'm grateful anyway. Every impossible, dangerous piece of it, because it's the reason we're sitting in this garden at all." "I love you too," Ivy said, simply, because there was no longer any conspiracy left to hide behind, no danger left to blame for the words instead of just letting them be true. I have for a while now. I just didn't know how to say it around everything else we were surviving. We're not surviving anything tonight, Lucian said, voice rough with something that sounded, for the very first time since she'd met him, entirely unguarded and entirely happy. Tonight we're just two people in a garden. Nothing hunting either of us. Nothing left to prove. No takebacks, Ivy said, echoing the phrase that had, somewhere over the last 3 months, become the closest thing either of them had to a vow. No takebacks, Lucian agreed, and kissed her, slow and certain and entirely without urgency, in a garden that had finally, after one long and impossible season, stopped feeling like enemy territory and become, simply and completely, home. Behind them, deep beneath the Academy's ancient stone foundations, the old binding hummed steady and secure, freely renewed, owing nothing to anyone who might have tried to take it by force. Voss served his sentence in the Northern Court's custody, his testimony filed alongside Kestrel's own confession in an archive now guarded by people who understood exactly what it had cost to keep it honest. Isolde Blackwood, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined her, had begun, slowly and without fanfare, to become someone Ivy found she genuinely didn't mind sharing a classroom with. Constance had already started planning, loudly and with great enthusiasm, an entirely unnecessary celebration for the end of term, on the grounds that a school that had survived an attempted ancient catastrophe deserved, at minimum, better cake than the dining hall usually offered. There was no shadow left waiting beneath Ravenscourt Academy. No hidden patron plotting in the north. No altered record. No locked cabinet. No unnamed hand still reaching for Ivy Marlowe's blood. There was only a girl who had arrived at these gates as an ordinary human ward, unremarkable and afraid, and who left that garden, months later, as exactly what she had always been underneath every careful, frightened disguise her father had taught her to wear. The last of the Dawnborn, whole and unhidden, loved and protected not because of what her blood could offer anyone, but simply, entirely, for herself. She would be facing whatever came next, new terms, new classes, an ordinary, wonderfully unremarkable future, not as a ward, not as a key, not as bait. As herself. Finally, completely, and for good. The end.